The Bible reading today, just one verse from Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, what a week it's been in the news, and what a month it has been, this last month of June 2025. We have all heard of the atrocities perpetrated by Hamas terrorists against Israeli civilians on that famous date, October 7, 2024, and the military responses and counter-responses, and on it goes. That deplorable conflict that is far from over is now further complicated by evidence of mass starvation and allegations of genocide in Gaza and Israeli pogroms against Palestinians living in Israel. And this is merely one of a number of conflicts going on in our world today. As one of our own poets has said, conquistador of Mexico, the Zulu and the Navajo, the Belgians in the Congo, short memory. Plantation in Virginia, the Raj in British India, the deadline in South Africa, short memory. The story in El Salvador, the silence of Hiroshima, destruction of Cambodia, short memory. Short memory must have a short memory. Short memory must have a short memory. And military conflict between nations is just one type among many of conflicts in our lives, in our world. We think of family violence, the conflicts caused by fear and greed all around us and within, misunderstandings, personality differences, broken friendships, all of these things and more contribute to the absence of tranquility, the absence of well-being in our lives and in our communities. And into our broken and hurting world, into our broken and hurting spirits, comes the clear, calm voice of Jesus of Nazareth in Matthew 5, verse 9, the seventh beatitude, where he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children or sons and daughters of God." Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Now, this is the only time in the New Testament where the New Testament writers use the word peacemakers. There's a famous, we use it as a benediction, there's a famous verse at the end of the letter to the Hebrews, which talks about the God of peace. And Paul especially talks a lot about peace in Romans and other places. But this is the only place where we find the word peacemakers in the New Testament. And it probably relates to all kinds of conflict. So it's like the other Beatitudes, it's very broad and it applies to a whole range of different situations and contexts. But it certainly, I think, relates to anything to do with impersonal quarrels right through to world wars. Blessed are the peacemakers. And Beatitudes 5 to 8, so you've got the first four and then the second four. Different commentators divide them up in different ways. Some of them have three groups and others have two. I think two is just the nice, simple way. First four and the second four. The second four, as I've said already in previous sermons, are what I call the active Beatitudes, calling us to concrete action as we follow the way of Jesus. Concrete action in making peace in this case. And all of those Beatitudes are general calls to which we may attach specific practices. And Kathy's already reminded us this morning of the words of Martin Luther King Jr. and the importance of non-violence. That's one of the tools in the tool chest of peacemaking, one of the key tools, but it's not the only one. And there are general calls here in the Beatitudes to which we attach specific practices to act with mercy, to cultivate purity of heart. We saw that last week. And here today to engage in peacemaking. And next week we'll look at living righteously and embodying justice in the face of active persecution. Salvation and the privilege of participation in the kingdom of God is never earned, but it always requires effort. It's never earned. We can't earn our own salvation. That's what God does for us. But salvation does require effort on our own parts. And so there's that tension in a way, because we'd like to earn our own salvation if we were honest with ourselves. But God says, you can't. It's not possible. And so he comes in and brings salvation into our world and into our lives on behalf of us and for us. But salvation also requires from us some effort, and that is the work of discipleship. If you think even briefly on any conflict situation that you have experience of or that you're aware of, you will almost certainly, I think, recognise that the situation is complex. It may seem like a simple disagreement on the surface, but peel back that surface layer and there's usually going to be complexity. And that's what makes making peace so difficult, because we're not aware of all the different aspects to what brings the conflict into the here and now. And sometimes we'll never be aware of all of the things that contribute to the conflicts around us. Even global conflicts that are seemingly very black and white are often very much grey when we dig into the details. And so the solution to such conflicts is likewise going to often be difficult and multi-layered. And of course, we may be just tempted to give up. It's too hard. I don't have the skills. I don't have the resources. I don't have the knowledge to deal with this situation. We may be tempted to assume that peace is at best an aspiration, and ending a serious quarrel is often beyond us. And world peace is most certainly an unattainable utopia. And many people in our world today take those views and say, it's all too difficult. I will just go to the movies and I will just listen to my music and I will shut out the things that make me feel uncomfortable, whether it's a conflict between myself and my neighbour or whether it's global warfare, as we have seen so much in the last few weeks. But peace is what Jesus calls us to make. Blessed are the peacemakers. And so the disciple, the apprentice, the follower of Jesus is called by Jesus, by the Master, to look into the toolbox and find ways for us to make peace. It's very active. We are to make peace. Jesus doesn't call us to be peaceable, although that would be a good start. Jesus doesn't call us to be peacekeepers, brokers of a fragile truce between warring parties, although such work is admirable. Jesus calls us to make the peace, to bring into being a social good that does not yet exist in this or that conflict situation. And the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 to 7, the Sermon on the Mount does not merely, if at all, set out to show poor sinners how incapable they are to attain their own salvation and drive them to their knees and compel them to plead for mercy. That is certainly one way that we can read the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, but that is not, I think, the essence of what Jesus is on about in this teaching. One of the aims, at least, of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 to 7, and especially these Beatitudes in chapter 5, verses 3 to 10, one of the aims is to set us on our feet again and to give us the strength to go out and be a help in the world. And the enemies of peacemaking are many, but I've summarised them as self-assertiveness, a lack of empathy, and a divisive spirit. And we could add apathy, I suspect, to that list. The enemies of peacemaking are where we try to assert ourselves into a situation, or when we have a lack of empathy for those who are suffering and those who are alone, and those who are the subject of violence, and a divisive spirit. We might ourselves be the cause of the conflict. Isn't that true? When there's a divisive spirit. And above them all or below them all is apathy. Not it's too hard, but I can't be bothered. And that is not something that the child of God should be pursuing. Of all people in the world, Christians ought to be marked by self-denial, by an abundance of empathy. And if we're not empathetic naturally, there are skills that we can learn empathy. And we should also be marked by a spirit of unity and fellowship, not being divisive, but having a spirit of unity and fellowship, always looking for that point of connection where people can come together and talk to each other rather than being alone and isolated and at war. And also, God delights in helping us to reach our full potential, every one of us. He delights to help us to reach our full potential in all of these areas of self-denial, of abundance of empathy, and of a spirit of unity and fellowship, if only we ask him for help, if only we seek God's guidance, if only we listen to his wisdom. And so service or selfless ministry to others is central to the work of discipleship. And if you and I are not pursuing the practices entailed in the Beatitudes, all 10 of them, or all 8 of them, then we are not walking in the way of Jesus. This is why the Beatitudes are there in the Sermon on the Mount. This is why they're at the start of the Sermon on the Mount, because they are so fundamental, they are so basic to what it means to be a follower of Jesus, so basic as to what it means to be a Christian. Similarly, if a church is not marked by a commitment to pursuing these practices of mercy and purity and peacemaking and justice, we'll talk about justice next week, then I would suggest that the church, whether it's a congregation or a denomination, is failing to fulfil one of the 5 purposes to which the writings of the New Testament call every church, what I would call diaconal service in the world. Yes, we worship God. Yes, we come together and receive discipleship training and teaching and all the other things. But when a church is not active in the world in bringing peace to others, in bringing peace into conflict situations, in binding up the wounds of the brokenhearted and such like, then we're not fulfilling our mission in the world. The good news is that God helps those who cannot help themselves. And God also helps those who try to help others. But he does not, in any of these 8 Beatitudes, and especially here in the one about peacemaking, he does not help those who think they can help themselves. It's all about other. It's never about self. And so you and I might think that there is actually very little that we can do here to solve the Middle East crisis or to solve the Ukrainian-Russian war or whatever the smaller conflict might be that you're aware of in your own context. We might think, well, what can I possibly do? Well, if all that you can do is to pray for peace, you're starting well. And every one of us can pray to God and ask God to bring peace to a situation that God brings to our mind. If all you can do is to encourage the next generation of young people to consider the merits of an ethic of non-violence in a world where we're filled with the passion for violence and destruction and war and death and violence, then you are doing well. As George MacLeod, the Scottish Presbyterian minister and founder of the Iona community in Scotland, put it, where people are praying for peace, the cause of peace is being strengthened by their very act of prayer, for they are themselves becoming immersed in the spirit of peace. So prayer is at the heart of peacemaking. Prayer to God is at the heart of peacemaking. And apart from prayers for peace, How can we move forward? How can you and I move forward to embrace the beautiful ideal of this beatitude, of making peace? Well, I'm not going to give you a list of things, but I'm going to say a few words. For those who choose the way of Jesus in the world, there is no place for retaliation for injustice. Someone is unjustly acting towards me. As a follower of Jesus, it's not right for me to retaliate. Of course, that goes against our human nature, doesn't it? We always want to fight back, and sometimes it's necessary to fight back in self-defence. That's not what I'm talking about. But the simple urge to retaliate is what brings everyone into the conflict in the first place. And if we can, by God's grace, say no to that, then things start going well. No one who is a follower of Jesus ought to have a place for retribution for wrongs. Now, we live in a society and we live in a time in history when retribution in the justice system is the way to go, and we punish wrongdoers and we send them to jail, and in some countries we send them to the gas chamber or something else in order to bring about retribution for their wrongdoings. We don't do that very often. We do imprison people, but we don't have capital punishment in Australia. But all of those things are about retaliation or retribution for wrongs. And a more enlightened approach, and an approach that follows more closely to the way of Jesus, is restorative justice. And that's another tool in the toolbox of peacemaking. But what do we say about policing and our military? How does that connect with Jesus saying, blessed are the peacemakers, not peacekeepers, but peacemakers? Well, I would say, I have to be very careful with my wording here, but I would say that with the possible exception of policing and military service, there is no place for seeking justice through violence in our world. Certainly that's the case for individuals. There's no place for me to seek justice through violence. And I would suggest that with some small exceptions, such as policing and military service, military service, there is no place for seeking justice through violence. It ought to be achieved through other means, and primarily, of course, being diplomacy, however difficult that might be. But we're not here to talk about military and policing today, just peacemaking for you and for me. Peacemaking is not about being a doormat for other people. It's not about being a doormat for power brokers in the hope that they too will grow servant hearts. Peacemaking is not about being nice or being tolerant in the hope that good manners will one day win the day. Peacemaking is an active entrance into the middle of warring parties, where we actually take the risk and take the effort to move into the centre of a conflict situation, whether it's one-on-one or bigger. We move into the centre of that conflict situation, and we have a purpose of creating reconciliation and peace, bringing the warring parties together to the table to work out a solution to the problem, an end to the conflict, an end that satisfies, hopefully, both parties, and they can move on, maybe not together, but in the absence of the conflict. Peacemaking is achieved not by pretending there are no differences between us or by suppressing those differences, but by creating love of the other that transcends the differences, or that permits the people to join hands in spite of their differences. So we acknowledge that not everyone's going to think like I do, and not everyone is going to act the way I act. Not everyone is going to have the opinions that I share with other people. Maybe we can start by peacemaking by sharing fewer of those opinions on social media. That's a good start, I suspect, as well. But it is important to be clear about the nature and about the goal of Christian peacemaking. When we engage in peacemaking, the way that Jesus is talking about here, whether it's a quarrel or whether it's a business disagreement or whether it's a war, we are becoming co-creators with God of the divine ideal of what the Bible calls shalom, peace or perfect peace, tranquility, well-being. All of those things together describe the Hebrew word shalom. And Jesus embodies this beatitude of peacemaking, this ideal of shalom, right from the very beginning of his public ministry. You might remember, and I mentioned it before, it's so significant. He stands up, almost unknown, carpenter's son in Nazareth, and reads from the scroll of Isaiah in his normal, what we'd call his normal church-going practice in the synagogue. And then he makes this amazing statement based on Isaiah's prophecy. And he says, here's what I'm here to do. Here's what I'm about to do. Here is my mission from God. And a lot of it is about peacemaking and restoration and freedom and well-being and tranquility. And he goes on throughout his life on earth, that short life, making the peace. And so I could say with assurance, I think, that Jesus is the peacemaker par excellence. And peacemaking was integral to his ministry. He went around doing good. He went around meeting human needs, bringing people together, creating shalom in the hearts and in the communities that he walked among. And for those with eyes to see in the Gospels, Jesus fulfilled Jewish expectations of a messianic kingdom with a king who was going to bring peace. And there's famous verses in Isaiah and in Zechariah that we sometimes hear at Christmas time about the new king born in the Bethlehem stable. And he is the king of the Jews, but he is also the king who brings peace. Isaiah especially, and Zechariah, and also other Old Testament Hebrew prophets identify the one who is to come as one who would bring peace. And Jesus came, and Jesus brought peace, partly through the blood of his cross, as Paul reminds us, but partly also as a reminder that this is possible for all of us, that peacemaking is possible for all of us. And so those who follow Jesus do as Jesus did. Biblical scholar Frederick Bruner suggests that biblical shalom conveys the picture of a circle that keeps on going around, and we keep on making it as we go around. He says it means communal well-being in every direction and in every relation, and all those who give their lives to rounding the circle or creating just communities and bringing reconciliation to warring parties are dignified by Jesus with membership in the very family of God. And that takes us to the promise at the end of this beatitude. The promise associated with peacemaking is the gift of being known as sons or daughters of God. Peacemakers are on the side of God. Peacemakers are in the family of God. They identify with the God of peace. A little bit later in this same chapter of Matthew, verses 44 and 45, Jesus says something very similar in a later context in the same bracket of teaching. And he says that he calls his followers to love their enemies. That's one of the tools in our toolbox, is to do the counterintuitive thing and find love in our hearts, maybe only through God's grace, but to find love in our hearts for those that we would identify as our enemies. That's counterintuitive, if anything is. And we see it working in the non-violent work of Martin Luther King Jr. and many others. But what does Jesus say after that? In Matthew 5, verses 44 and 45, he says, he calls his followers to love their enemies so that you will be children of your Father in heaven. It's the same thing as it is there in verse 9. Love your enemies so that you may be called children of your Father in heaven, sons of God, daughters of God. And so it's not about achieving salvation through good works, but accepting family identity and responsibility. Commenting on this beatitude in verse 9, theologian Leon Morris, yea, Lithgow, says that, he was born in Lithgow, says that those who work for peace are fulfilling what membership in the family really means. And this is something to which all members of the family must aspire. None of us gets out of that. If we want to be known as and identify with the family of God, sons and daughters of God, it's expected of us that we will take on the ministry of peacemaking, starting with ourselves and those closest to us. So the challenge and the goal, I think, are clear. Not easy, but clear. And so is the reward. Following the way of Jesus is what we are called to do. Identifying as sons and daughters of God through the practice of peacemaking. What an opportunity. What a blessing. So let us not have short memories, as that Midnight Oil song tells us. Let us not leave the work of peacemaking to others. Let us find ourselves among those who diffuse the conflict and who make peace and who fill our world with God's love. I conclude with a quotation from a new book about peacemaking by biblical scholar Jesse Nichol that I was reading this week. And he says, "The church is a community that is formed and shaped around a crucified Saviour. Around a crucified Saviour. That's what gives us our identity." And he says, "The Christian, therefore, does not pursue as of first importance self-preservation, or the greater good, or human rights. Rather, the Christian pursues the way of Jesus and faithfulness to the way of life defined by the kingdom of Shalom. In this way," he says, "the community of followers of Jesus," that's you and me, "shines the light, hope, and character of God in the world." That's our mission. And others can respond or otherwise to the light that God gives, to the way forward that God provides, to the tranquility and the well-being and the peace that are really only possible, ultimately, through God's mercy and grace to us.